Let's just get this out the way. I'm going to issue a general spoiler warning right off the jump for this whole video. I don't plan on doing a beat-by-beat analysis of the plot or anything like that, but I'd like to talk freely about 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim for the remainder of this video. So, if you haven't played the game and it's been on your radar, I'll just say this. If the title has you interested for any reason, check it out. You can find it pretty cheap now, and it has a lot going on for it. If you like visual novels, check it out. If you like strategy RPGs, check it out. Pause the video, save it to your watch later list, maybe subscribe to the channel, do whatever you gotta do. But this is your warning, and I don't want to ruin the experience for you. I hadn't even made it halfway through 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim when a thought occurred to me, and that was, this game has gone off the fucking rails and there is no way that they are going to be able to tie this all up in a way that is even marginally satisfying. What I had played up until that point was great and I was having a lot of fun with the title. But after every chapter, every session, every revelation, the plot just kept becoming more and more complicated to the point where I was certain it was going to crumble under its own weight. And this feeling didn't let up until just the last few hours with the experience. And that is because by the point that this game started giving me this feeling, the plot had already begun to include elements such as 13 playable characters, all of which were protagonists in their own right, time travel to multiple eras, some of which featured different permutations of the 13 playable characters, talking cats that hand out magical guns, characters that had their personalities reset and had become completely different characters altogether, even though they shared the same names and faces as other characters we've been introduced to, mecha, kaiju, corporate conspiracies, potential alien invasions, men in black, love interests from different timelines, allusions to tons of sci-fi classics that have been renamed to avoid legal troubles, schoolgirls that look identical to main characters that are in reality androids that house the AI personality of a wanted criminal who in and of himself is a feature version of a different character, imaginary friends, parallel universes, corporate espionage, downloading consciousness, mind uploading, simulation theory, terraforming new planets, coding shortcuts, pop stars stranded in outer space, mech battles for the future of mankind, yakisoba pon, incredibly horny teenagers, incredibly horny adults, and even incredibly horny robots. And that is by no means all that transpires in this story. Those are just some rapid fire examples that I was able to pull off the top of my head after my 40 plus hours with the game. In a lot of ways, it feels like George Kamitani, main writer and director for Aegis Rim, was asked, "So, you want to make a sci-fi game? Which genre of science fiction are we going for?" And the man just answered, yes. What started off as a story that was clearly inspired by Evangelion and kaiju movies.
A kaiju attacked, like in that movie. So we'll do what we have to do. Get in the robots and fight.
Started to act as a cultural sponge, soaking up all of the touchstones of modern sci-fi while peering directly into the existential side of Japanese storytelling. And yet, somehow, it all comes together by the end. It isn't always graceful.
This is a virtual world. It's not just the clothes. I can be whatever I want here.
But Kamitami is a madman. And he not only chose the impossible, but he and the rest of the extremely talented team at vanillaware accomplished it as best as I think is humanly possible. Quick aside, Kamitami isn't just some random video game director or writer. He has been doing this for a very long time, with some of his earliest involvement in the industry including things like Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Hillsfar for the Famicom and Princess Crown for the Sega Saturn. But Kamitami really came into his own with the advent of the studio vanillaware. Founded by Kamitami in 2002 under the name Puraguru, I hope I'm saying that right, the studio spent its first 2 years working alongside Squaresoft on an MMO known as Fantasy Earth: The Ring of Dominion. But between tensions during development and the changing of the guard during the Square Enix merger of April 2003, Kamitami cut ties with the publisher, found new office space, and changed the company's name to the vanillaware of today. And although the studio tends to cater to more of a cult audience, games like Grim Grimoire, which was co-developed and published by Nippon Ichi Software, Odin Sphere published by Atlas, Muramasa the Demon Blade published by Marvelous, and Dragon's Crown published again by Atlas. These games definitely not only showcased Vanillaware's amazing trademark visual style, but also solidified their reputation as amazing action RPG developers. But Dragon's Crown was released in 2013. So with 13 Sentinels releasing in late 2019 for the Japanese market and April 2020 worldwide amid the pandemic, this proved not only to be the longest development cycle for Vanillaware, but also the most unusual, as Aegis Rim began its life pitched as a vehicle to jumpstart the sales of a toy line instead of just a video game altogether. But now, after playing this game 2 years after its initial release, I can confidently say that the majority of this development time must have gone into wrangling this oftentimes convoluted, other times poignant, and at all times ambitious narrative. I should say this up front, this is my first Vanillaware game that I've ever completed. Whether it was just timing or something just not clicking with some of the other titles, I've never managed to play any of the other studio's titles for more than an hour or so. I've always been aware of the studio's output, and I've always admired their game's signature art style more than anything, but I say all this as a disclaimer of sorts, because I am just not intimately familiar with any of their other games. I'm not somebody who has been a fan all along, and so for all purposes with this video, this may as well be my first foray into Vanillaware and Kamatami's work. But their games have always piqued my interest, and really it was a strange couple of coincidences that led to me choosing to cover this game at this particular moment. It's been sitting on my backlog for a little while, actually still shrink wrapped sitting on my shelf up until just a week or so ago. I started playing a different title altogether for my next video, but between bouncing off of that title, and during the meantime my girlfriend was also looking for something to play before I recommended this title to her. And after cracking this now 2-year-old game out of its packaging, I watched as she started playing through the opening hours, and right away, I was charmed. So much so that I started playing the game too after she was done with her sessions, but another factor was drawing me into the game, and that was something that's a bit more subtle. And that was my current state with my mental health. Without going too far into it, I, like tons of other people, deal with depression. And whether it be from the chemical side of the disorder or just situational stuff, I just sometimes find myself bummed out, unmotivated, and otherwise just off for certain periods of time. I'm in my 30s now. I'm used to it. I've seen the worst that this disorder has to offer, and I've also gotten decent at dealing with it. But sometimes shit just sucks for a while. But I should say I've done a lot of the work. I've got my support network. I know what my coping mechanisms are. I know what my stressors are. And I've been dealing with it long enough to where I know when I have to take that extra step and seek out further help. This has been more of a mild episode. So I was able to lean into one of my lifelong coping mechanisms, and that is going down the rabbit hole with an RPG. I don't quite understand it myself, but losing myself in an intricate narrative while obsessing over stat screens for 40 so hours, these types of games have always served as not only pure escapism, but also as some sort of reset mechanism for me. A way to make sense of an otherwise chaotic world by taking a time out from the other bullshit while grinding away and fixating on stat allocations. A small digital world where progress is measured by numbers going up and clever problem solving always being enough to get you out of any predicament. This genre has always been a comfort zone for me, and it probably will always serve as one. And then a day or two after diving into 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, I got hit with whatever seasonal virus has been making its way through the population. So I found myself on my ass, medicated, a little groggy, and suddenly with a week with nothing to focus on other than getting better and chipping away at this title. So here I am on the other side of completing Vanillaware's most ambitious game to date. And after wrapping my head around what the fuck happened in this game and checking over the footage and the in-game mystery files to make sure that it all wasn't just some sort of elaborate fever dream, I can honestly say that not only did I love this game, but it is also something that I consider to be something of a masterpiece in some regards, while also recognizing that this game has some pretty glaring flaws. So, for the uninitiated, what the fuck is Aegis Rim? Sorry, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. It's really a mouthful of a title. The easiest way to break down what this game is has already kind of been done for me in just the way that this game is structured. After making your way through a prologue that introduces you to all the game's systems and a good chunk of the cast, the game offers you free reign of 3 different modes to take yourself through the experience. These modes being Remembrance, Destruction, and Analysis. Remembrance is the mode that makes up the bulk of this game, and it is essentially a visual novel mixed with some light exploration and adventure gameplay. You make your way through all of the 13 main characters' stories 1 chapter at a time, sometimes hitting progression gates that require you to either advance a different character's story or make some progress elsewhere in the game. Each of these episodes advances the plot and gets the player further acquainted with the cast. And although all of the narratives are radically different, they feature a lot of crossover moments and all play functionally the same. You really only have 3 distinct ways of interacting with the world in this mode. You can click on interactable items or people, or you can dive into your character's mind through a thought cloud system. From here, you can consider a keyword that you've unlocked by interacting with the world or the people in it, and then the final piece of interactivity comes from presenting ideas that you've collected to other people in order to advance in the dialogue tree. Based off of the way that I've just described this mode probably doesn't sound too different from the gameplay found in adventure games like the Ace Attorney series or something like Grim Fandango.
Don't pet the cat that way.
But the key difference is that other than just a few outliers, 13 Sentinels does not really feature puzzles as a key component to this mode. While Phoenix Wright does the same thing of collecting ideas and evidence around the world before heading into the courtroom, Aegis Rim seldom requires close consideration in order to find a contradiction in what somebody is saying.
Objection!
This is not a game of presenting an idea to every character to see what they say or combining items in obtuse ways. Instead, Aegis Rim does a lot to make sure that the right path is almost always as clear as day. Between highlighting ideas that can be considered or arrows that show which ideas can be presented to whichever character you are talking to, this is a game about advancing the story, to the point where every screen that whichever character you are playing as in the moment has an indicator in the top right of the screen that lets you know if there are new ideas to consider in each setting, denoted by a green bar, or a red bar that tells the player that there is something that they need to present to another character. This is a visual novel in the most literal sense. There are some elements of interactivity, but they basically boil down to running left or right on any given screen and tackling ideas in your preferred order. But even with this limited interactivity, the game does throw up things like invisible walls to make sure that you are always on the right path. And usually, for someone like me, this is something of a turnoff. I typically play games to, play them, but between the gorgeous animations and backgrounds, characters and overall art style, tight scripting and pacing, I always found myself in a situation where I was just locked in. In a lot of ways, this mode serves more as a full anime series that you are lightly interacting with each chapter acting as an episode in the overall series. They are small and contained, terrifically produced, and usually end with some sort of cliffhanger to string you along to the next chapter. But this is where the initial problem I mentioned at the top of this video reared its head. With each chapter being a standalone moment in an increasingly complicated plot, and with the structure of the game requiring you to jump from character to character, these cliffhangers and last-minute revelations can pile up fast. And by the halfway point of this narrative, I was certain that this game was going to end up just as unsatisfying as the TV show Lost ended up being, as both properties had a nasty habit of asking far more questions than they were actually answering by the end of each episode. But Aegis Rim is no Lost. And pretty much every question I had was answered by the end. Some with some incredibly well thought out science fiction writing, and others in some not so well considered ways, but the point remains, this narrative strings you along, but does not end up with nothing but a whimper and confusion in the same way that Lost did. 13 Sentinels' story is pretty straightforward in the beginning hours. You play as mostly high schoolers from the fictional Sakura High School, and you hang out in the surrounding fictional sprawl of Ashitaba City. You talk to other students, hang out, eat food, chase cats around, but even in these early moments, there are signs that things aren't quite as they seem. Switching from character to character, you become quickly aware that some of these kids have time traveled from World War II Japan, and in some cases, the distant future of Ashitaba City. You've also been made aware that every one of these eras has been invaded by kaiju, and that the only obvious means of defense against these giants are the titular Sentinels, giant mechs, with early scenes and prologue battles making it clear that all of this is building towards a climactic battle for humanity. But pulling at any thread, finishing any chapter for any character results in further unraveling. So giving a plot synopsis is really a bit more difficult than it would be for most other games, as things as simple as relationships between characters may lead down the rabbit hole of discussing alternate timelines, implanted memories, and downloaded consciousness. But all of these moving pieces have a logic to their movement. In a lot of ways, if there was one modern TV series that I can compare this game to, it would be Netflix's Dark, a German language science fiction show that featured time travel as its core conceit. Both Aegis Rim and Dark are works of fiction that feature time travel, where they cast a wide net and always turn up the confusion. And both of these series do their job of that to great effect. When things started clicking together in Aegis Rim, I just kept finding myself more and more impressed. And after completing it, I just wish that there was some way of seeing the design docs and scenario planning for this project, as I am certain they look like Charlie's evidence board from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And what makes me certain of this assertion is the second of the 3 modes in this game, and that is the analysis mode. Whenever you finish a chapter in remembrance mode, you are always given a message on the results screen. And that is that one of the mystery files from this game's in-game encyclopedia has either been updated or something has been added to it. Divided into 2 sections, the event archive and the mystery files, this game stores information in a way that is always accessible at any point in the game. Whether it be something as simple as character bios, setting descriptions, or descriptions of in-game food like yakisoba pan, if it is in this game, you will eventually find it in the mystery files. And most of these entries are updated as the plot unfolds and the mysteries are revealed. And I have to admit, this is a godsend for staying on top of this game's narrative. One of the 13 characters is mentioned in passing and you've forgotten who this was. Pause the game, check your logs. Cool, I know what's going on now. Someone is lying unconscious on the ground and you're uncertain as to whether or not they were supposed to have lived or died after that scene. Check the logs. She's dead. And then the event archive gives brief synopsises to each episode that you've already unlocked. And these can even be further filtered by character to make it easier to get your ducks in a row. I couldn't tell you how many times a character would mention something and I would be like, what are they talking about again? Hit the touchpad on the PlayStation 5 controller to bring up the text log, and then tab over to the mystery files to do some light reading. Equal parts wiki and evidence board, this mode more or less proved to me that the team at vanillaware was just as interested in making sure that the player was always informed as they were in constantly dumping new concepts onto the player. And it really goes a long way in helping understanding a narrative this batshit crazy. In a lot of ways, this interplay between the story and cutting back and forth to read footnotes on this game's world reminded me of a novel called House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski, a novel about a family who discovers that their home houses a seemingly endless labyrinth. And this story is told from multiple perspectives and is littered with footnotes, some of which have footnotes themselves, appendices, and all sorts of supplementary material built into the structure of this narrative that descends into madness as the book goes on, getting to the point where the format itself requires jumping back and forth between pages as conflicting narratives are playing out, and some of which require the reader to actively rotate the novel in order to read it properly. And just as a little fun fact, this novel was a key inspiration on Sam Lake and Remedy's development of Control, so check it out if you're just into books that inspire video games. The constant jumping between reference material and narrative in Aegis Rim really struck me as similar to that novel. And with these 2 modes being so intrinsically married to one another, the third mode came as something of a surprise to me. Without spoiling too much at this moment, the narrative 13 Sentinels kind of begins and in some ways ends in a final battle for the future of humanity between giant mecha and kaiju. And this final battle is played out over the course of 30 or so chapters in the final mode of this game called Destruction. This mode stands out in a lot of ways for being the only place where gameplay is king. Where the adventure mode is a glorified anime, these battles are fought in a system that rides the line between being real-time strategy battles and turn-based RPG firefights. But this mode also stands out for being a huge departure in art style. Gone are the gorgeous hand-drawn 2D sprites of the Remembrance mode. This mode features a stripped-down grid-based interpretation of the city where giant mechs fend off giant repurposed construction equipment called kaiju or daimos. This world's in-game version of Godzilla himself. This mode is equal parts Fire Emblem and Ace Combat, as each of your 16 protagonists have their own mech divided into one of 4 classes that serve its own unique functionality in battle. And while this game doesn't feature permadeath, it does feature plenty of cross-chatter during and between battles to keep the player engaged, and it does have an interesting function that always comes with consequences. Whenever a mech pilot is present in battle, a mental and physical toll is taken on the pilot, and this is called brain overload. This has mechanical consequence where a character who has redlined this meter has to be benched until they recover from the fatigue. And this really plays not only into the drama, but also the strategy that comes with balancing the need to push certain MVPs while conversely scrambling when you have to sub in a fleet of underleveled characters. It is an awesome feature, and when coupled with how this game rewards consecutive wins by adding a multiplier to rewards, it makes it so that there is always something on the line whenever you enter a skirmish with a mix of some of your best and worst characters. Or, I should say that it would if you didn't have the choice of replaying an earlier level to aid in your character's recovery before each important battle, but this is arguably an exploit of the system. You know, RPG brain shit. But the battles themselves are always a joy to play. Enemies move fast until an ATB style meter is filled for one of your characters, and then the action pauses while you figure out where you're going to reposition your units or rain insane missile salvos onto the field. And between the sound design, the pacing, the crosstalk, and the pressure of S-ranking each mission in order to unlock more mystery files, these fights have a way of staying frantic throughout. And when later missions are tackled, it can become just absolutely gnarly how many enemies litter the screen. And then with the extra drama added by the narrative constantly pushing the point that this battle pretty much is guaranteed to end in failure, the game always does a great job of maintaining a balance of pushing the challenge without getting to the point where it's really frustrating. Honestly, I love this battle system. And between cycling characters in and out of the front lines and checking the special conditions for each mission with things like limiting the amount of pilots on the team or requiring specific pilots for each battle in order to unlock more rewards, even the menu-heavy side of preparing for each battle always managed to lock me in fully. Small decisions like upgrading a mech's weapons or upgrading defense points all come with a little extra drama because of these design choices. And so this mode was really something of a highlight in this game's 40 plus hours. Overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds by repositioning a long-range attacker at the last second, having a melee unit leap into the fray moments after having an all-rounder lay down suppressing fire with sentry guns, or sending a flight support unit into the fray to take out a shield generator, this game has a way of having each strategic choice feel consequential not only to the battles going on in front of you, but feeding into the overall drama of the narrative. And after spending so many hours in the visual novel and obsessing over the archives, this mode serves as a cathartic foil to the rest of this game's low-stakes interactions. I really can't speak more highly of this mode, but there is an underlying problem. And that is just that this mode in some key ways really feels completely divorced from the rest of the experience. 1. Missions are locked behind plot progression in Remembrance mode, so you will be enjoying the battles, but then you'll hit a wall where you have to go back into Remembrance mode before you can continue. And 2. At the end of each Remembrance chapter, you are not only rewarded with mystery files and updates, but also meta chips. This game's currency for upgrading Sentinels, pilots, and defense points called Terminals. So in a lot of ways, with Destruction mode rewarding optimal play, you are not only incentivized to play the Remembrance mode first as much as possible before going over to the Destruction mode by having more to do in the mode, but also by banking the resource in order to perform optimally. This is somewhat remedied by the fact that specific chapters in the Adventure mode conversely require a certain level of progression in the Destruction mode to unlock new chapters, but I couldn't help but shake the feeling that Aegis Rim was always prioritizing its story far more than this other mode. And with things like a far more simplified art style, locking progression, and by failing to really integrate these battles into the story, this mode felt like a separate game altogether in some ways. With its campaign taking place solely in the final battle of the overall narrative, there is a progress gating mechanic, where the bulk of these battles are intentionally siloed off until the end of the game. And for me, this did end up working to punctuate the final moments of the narrative with one last push, but when talking to some of my friends who have also played this game, they stated the opposite. One of my closest friends that I've mentioned on this channel a few times before, shoutouts to Chris, he explained this game's final moments revolving around this mode as a last-minute roadblock. For him, 13 Sentinels was at its best when it was free to be a visual novel, and whenever he had to jump into this mode, he found it to be a slightly annoying departure that he felt was just there to tick off a feature for the back of the box. An undercooked strategy game that popped up out of nowhere that seemed only to serve as padding before this game's narrative conclusion. And it's interesting that both of us, while we do disagree on the quality of the combat, we both left feeling like these two modes, they just weren't balanced correctly to maximize this game's enjoyment. Where he felt that the mixed combat got in the way of the visual novel, I felt like the hours of watching what was ostensibly a complete anime series was punctuated by the promise of larger-than-life mech battles. And while that promise was delivered, I couldn't help but feel like some of the design choices lessened these battles. Prioritizing the narrative first and foremost, and art style choices such as having awesome animations for each upgrade you've purchased for your mech reduced to little postage stamp sized demonstrations instead of being integrated into the battles themselves really struck me as leaving this mode slightly undercooked in some ways. And with more than just a few mech battles taking place over the course of this narrative outside of the final battle being completely unplayable, I couldn't help but wish for a version of this game that figured out a better way to integrate these two modes. But after finishing this game and thinking back on what it was, I couldn't help but understand that this narrative kinda had to be the focus. And again, when I think about how they somehow tied together this nightmare of a narrative, I can't help but applaud the team. And some of the choices that they made, they were just rad. In the back half of the story, it is revealed that everything that has taken place in the Remembrance mode is a simulation. The kaiju, the school days, the Sentinels, and even a lot of the supporting cast, all of this is a simulation. The real world had crumbled due to a virus in population-wide implanted nanomachines killing off the majority of the population. And after setting off in a colony ship with a few survivors in stasis until they reached a habitable planet, the remaining humans, or at least their next hope or iteration, had their consciousness uploaded to a simulation until they were able to emerge into base reality once again. But because of lazy coding, basically the simulation runs on code borrowed from a VR game that simulated a large Japanese city with lifelike NPCs. But in reality, that is not all that the VR game simulated, as the VR game was actually an experience where kaiju invaded this lifelike city. But the programmer decided that this was a good enough base for the simulation that they were creating, and basically just partitioned off the kaiju part of the simulation. But they did not remove this code altogether, so all it took was for a bad actor to delete the partition to inject the code back into the simulation. So, what was supposed to be a representation of Earth that was in an idyllic setting, it became a battleground in a simulation that was always forced to reset itself when a fail state was met like a video game would. I cannot stress how much I dug this. One, I've had to do some light coding in my professional life, and the amount of times I've run off to Pastebin to borrow solutions that other people have figured out, people who are way more talented than me, I can't even tell you how many times I've done this. And it's not just me, as friends of mine who are far more talented in all aspects of computer science have told me that borrowing code is essential for them to optimize their own projects. So this monumental oversight in Aegis Rim's story is not only believable, but in some ways it's hilarious and horrifying. If you have at least one conspiratorial bone in your body, you've probably heard of simulation theory. Assuming any level of technological evolution, just look at what we've managed to do in just the video game space since its inception, it is almost impossible to imagine a future where virtual realities that are indistinguishable from what we know as base reality isn't likely. And the moment that we are able to turn on a machine that can run a simulation that mirrors what we know as reality, all bets are off as to whether or not we are not already in a simulation ourselves. I don't know where I fall on this theory. I feel like I'm in reality, but if simulations that were one-to-one with reality were possible, and all senses were engaged in a lifelike manner, how the fuck would you be able to tell where you were in relation with quote-unquote real life? And to think that all of this could come crashing down because the initial programmer left in a bit of code where Godzilla could RNG from the ether, it's a fun thought experiment at the least. Aegis Rim is full of thoughtful sci-fi experiments like this. Downloading your consciousness into robots, or just partitioning your own consciousness into the boot sector of the simulation, guaranteeing that some version of you gets to exist with the memories before the last simulation was forced to reset. Time travel not being time travel at all, but different time periods just acting as simultaneous instances running inside the same program. Everything here is science fiction today, but they are fun things to ponder over. But as complicated as this narrative can get, what makes it relatable and ultimately what carries the plot is the cast of 13 playable protagonists. They all play the same, but the circumstances between their narratives couldn't be more different. A man from World War II era Japan tasked with piloting a Sentinel finding himself stranded in the 1980s after a time jump to a new time where the war was lost, trying desperately to find his way back home while also coming to grips with his own sexuality. A boy who had his identity and memories rewritten after having his brain overloaded after sitting in a mech for too long, basically being forced to live as a different individual as dreams from his past self cloud his subconsciousness. A young woman who takes a deal with a talking cat to use a magical gun to tag witches and seal their power, who in reality is talking to an AI that is tagging the cast with nanomachines that force them into the in-game mech battle. A ruse that she buys into because she is hoping to restore the brain overloaded boy's memories. All these scenarios are sci-fi and complicated, but nearly every story is truly about each of these 16 characters finding their own personal reason to fight in an unwinnable final battle. And in nearly every case, love is the answer. Or sometimes these are just horny teenagers. And even though there were moments in this game that were overly horny and characters were just all being shipped off to one another, I would be able to forgive it since these are teenagers. But when you remember that this game is written, designed, and artistically brought to life by adults choosing to play out some of their fantasies in a story about teenagers, it can sometimes come across as a little creepy. Choices such as Morimura as well, just Morimura, or our heroes being stripped down upon entry to their mechs for plot reasons. Yeah, I just don't know. You tell me how you feel about this stuff. But in spite of the horniness, in spite of the overly convoluted story up until the very end, in spite of the feel-good ending, which seemed like it was going to be anything but, which also was incredibly horny, but I guess these characters are 20 years old now, so it's okay. And in spite of some poor integration between these games' modes, these slight missteps never really pulled away from my enjoyment of the game. What is here is one of the most beautiful looking games I've ever seen. Hitoshi Sakamoto's incredible soundtrack never ceased to amaze, and the way that the plot flirted with jumping the shark at almost every turn and yet came out of the other end as a thought-provoking venture into modern science fiction storytelling, and a battle system that, while not always implemented the best, really managed to ground the action and split-second strategic gameplay. This game is incredible, and I recommend it to anyone that it even slightly appeals to. And I could easily double this video's length and still find nuances to discuss. The fact that all of these things somehow come together is in a lot of ways a miracle. Aegis Rim is not a perfect game, but it is a hell of a game, and I loved it. I loved almost my entire time with it. And wasn't that the point of this game all along? As flawed as it could be, as disjointed as its realities were, love was still the answer. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. It's always greatly appreciated. And if you liked the video, please consider dropping a like, comment, or subscribe. And if there are other visual novels that you'd like to see covered on this channel, or any other RPGs in general, please drop those in the comments too. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. You're all beautiful people, and I hope you all have a nice day.